It is time for StreetWise with former chief of the New York City Sheriff's Department, former chief of the Seagate Police Department, retired New York City detective, Time Warner Public Access Media Award, Joe Franklin Super Excellence in Broadcasting Memory Lane Award, New York Veteran Police Association StreetWise Productions, host of StreetWise, Mr. Lou Telano.
Good evening and welcome back to StreetWise. My guest this evening is a former federal prosecutor. You've seen him on the various TV talk shows as a guest and a contributor. And the timing is great to have him on, especially what's going on with this impeachment inquiry, hearing, whatever the term is. But my guest will, will explain that pretty much to you guys and even to me. Okay. Now, I've got so many calls to say, hey, Lou, is this the same Robert Ray that was who headed the Whitewater scandal going way back into the 90s, which I think started maybe in the late 70s or early 80s, and it came to surface, I think, 1995. Again, my guest will correct me on that. Ken Starr was the head of the Independent Counsel at that time, and then my guest took over, and I'm going to ask him why he took over. It's my pleasure to introduce Robert Ray. Robert, welcome to StreetWise.
Thanks, Lou. Great to be with you.
Okay.
Well, it was actually 20 years ago this past weekend that I was appointed independent counsel, October 19th, 1999.
Day after my birthday. My birthday was on the 18th. So, okay.
Time flies.
Exactly right. Okay. Now, what happened with Ken Starr leading it, and then you took over?
I was asked to come over. I had been part of another independent counsel investigation that involved the former Secretary of Agriculture, Mike Espy. There was a case that came out of that investigation that I argued in the Supreme Court. And once that was over, Ken Starr asked me to come over to the Whitewater investigation. I was there for 6 months. I was asked, among other things, to conclude the prosecution of Webb Hubbell, the former Associate Attorney General of the United States. And once we finished that, Ken Starr announced that he was leaving. My name was submitted to the appointing authority, which was the Special Division of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. And the presiding judge of that court called me in and said, I have just one question for you. I need to confirm first that you'll be the craziest person in America to actually take this job if we offered it to you.
Makes sense.
And I said yes, and he said, okay, the job is yours, so that's what happened. And that was 20 years ago.
Right. Now, again, Hillary and Bill Clinton were involved in that as well. Now, when they were involved, the name surfaced later on. Folks, we're talking about, some people call it fraud. Maybe it was former prosecutor here will explain what that was. It had to do with real estate, prime property, banks, maybe deception. And there were some people that were indicted and arrested. But your conclusion was that there was no evidence in regard to Bill Clinton and Mr. and Mrs. Clinton, I should say.
On some things, with regard to Whitewater, that's true.
Right.
And remember, it wasn't just that. I mean, the Whitewater investigation arose out of the savings and loan crisis. That was part of it. There were also matters related to the firing of the travel office employees, FBI, the unauthorized access to FBI files, and then I guess most famously, ultimately, the investigation took a completely unexpected course and veered in the direction of Monica Lewinsky. With regard to the Monica Lewinsky, those were really in many ways more serious because ultimately that is what led to impeachment. It involved allegations involving perjury and obstruction of justice. And at the end of the day, I did conclude, these were findings that were ultimately released as part of a final report, that while the president may have committed crimes, there were alternatives to federal criminal prosecution that really, I think, counseled in favor, in the best interest of the country, not to proceed with a criminal case against a former president once he left office. But the condition of the resolution of that was a deal that was struck in which he had to acknowledge responsibility for providing false testimony. He had to surrender his law license, pay a fine, agree not to seek legal fees under the Independent Counsel statute. And so if those conditions were satisfied, I then agreed that I would exercise my discretion and not prosecute him once he left office, which I think in retrospect was the right decision. Recall also that deal was announced in January of 2001, and it was only 10 months later that 9/11 happened.
Correct.
I don't think it would have been in the country's interest to have a former president pending trial following indictment when there was a foreign policy crisis, obviously, which 9/11 was. So, presidents are a unique office in our
Yes.
constitutional system, as we are now finding out.
Right.
If we didn't learn that lesson before during Whitewater or before again
Yeah.
during the Nixon years, it's very difficult to hold a president to account. That's not to suggest that a president is above the law, but there are unique features to the office of the presidency that provide him or her with understandable latitude, not to get away with improper conduct, but mostly to understand that if there are things about a president's actions that you don't like, the preferred procedure is to vote them out of office. It's not to try to
Correct.
impeach them and remove them from office, which obviously represents an overturning of the will of the people and the results of the last election. So, those are the sorts of things that I think the framers of the Constitution well understood.
Yes.
And sometimes I think we would do well to try to relearn some of those lessons before we sort of, go off in one direction about, we don't like the president's conduct or we think he's abused his office. And even though he hasn't committed a crime,
Right.
or there hasn't been any showing that he committed a crime, we should just get him, out of office anyway. I don't think that. I think the framers would have understood that to be not what they had intended. I think Alan Dershowitz not long ago wrote an op-ed article in which he said something to the effect, Alexander Hamilton would not agree with this
Yes.
impeachment. Now, understand Alexander Hamilton is only one founder.
Yes.
But he's an important one nonetheless, and I think he would have said and explained, and has through the Federalist Papers,
Right.
it takes well-founded articles of impeachment require two things. One, treason, bribery, or other high crime or misdemeanor.
Misdemeanors, yeah.
And two, abuse of the public trust or abuse of office. And, history has shown that unless both are present, that's not an appropriate basis to remove a president from office.
Okay. So actually, the decision was pretty much based on the best interest of the country.
I think that's right. That's not always the reason why
Right.
you exercise discretion not to do what the law would otherwise allow you to
sure.
do. But understand also, federal prosecutors, it's no different if you're talking about a former president or current president. Former prosecutors have discretion and latitude to decide whether or not the public interest requires that a prosecution be brought. The Department of Justice has guidelines with regard to that
Yeah.
issue, and those guidelines are the principles of federal prosecution, which bind all federal prosecutors,
Yes.
including whether it's Bob Mueller or myself or Ken Starr or Leon Jaworski or
Right.
anybody who has at the time the authority to decide whether or not a president has committed a criminal offense.
Interesting. Okay. That leads us into what's going on today. What do we call this? The impeachment of Donald Trump that's going on by Adam Schiff is the head of this committee. Now, is this an inquiry? Is this a hearing? What is it actually? What's the proper terminology?
I
for
think
this?
the proper terminology
Yeah.
based upon history that would indicate it was the action of the entire House would be that an impeachment proceeding in the House is underway. That's not quite what this is, right? Because there's
Yes.
never been a House vote to authorize the opening of a proceeding. They've just simply, leadership has said,
Yes.
and designated, at least at the moment, after they sort of went through the beginnings of this with Jerry Nadler and the House Judiciary Committee, which didn't go so well as it related to the aftermath of the Mueller investigation. Now, with regard to matters involving Ukraine and the phone call,
Yes.
it's Adam Schiff's responsibility through the Intelligence Committee, and it's one committee headed by one committee chairman that constitutes apparently the basis for what is, I suppose, properly referred to at the moment as an impeachment inquiry.
Okay, now why does this go before the House Judiciary Committee as opposed to any other committee in the House?
Well, ordinarily in the past, what's happened is that the entire House has voted and authorized
Right.
the House Judiciary Committee to commence an impeachment proceeding where the articles of impeachment are drawn and ultimately passed upon in committee, which is what happened during Watergate. It's what happened during the Clinton impeachment.
Yeah.
And apparently, I mean, I don't remember since I wasn't alive then what
Correct.
happened during Andrew Johnson,
Judge,
but something
yeah.
equivalent to that
Right.
happened. And then once the committee votes favorably those articles of impeachment, they're referred to the House floor for a formal vote.
Right.
That's ordinarily what you would expect to happen. But that process, generally starts, since it's a constitutional process, that it should be the action of the entire House. Now, so far, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, for political reasons, has chosen not to do it that way. Presumably,
How does she have the authority or power to do that? To change? I mean, let me say this: or you change the rules.
well, there is no rule in the
Right.
House that requires that it be done this way. But when you do think about it in terms of the constitutional system that we're in,
Fairness, maybe.
there's partly that. I think in the past, fairness has dictated that if the House is going to act as a body, it means that the minority also has rights,
Yeah.
which means that the Republicans should also have the
Correct.
right to subpoena witnesses.
Yes.
There should be an open proceeding. They should have the right to cross-examine
Absolutely.
witnesses. And all those things are things that the president has mentioned, as well as members of the Republican Party in the House, to suggest that this proceeding is not fair, it's not open. Apparently, it's being conducted at the moment in the basement of the Capitol. And that Republicans have very little say over what happens, no right to subpoena witnesses, and largely, although they're there to observe the proceedings and in part sometimes to ask questions, it is not similar to what in the past what we would recognize historically as an impeachment proceeding conducted on a bipartisan basis by the body.
Right.
Which is the
but
House.
Is this within the impeachment proceedings normally? Because you just mentioned it's going to be pretty much run by one party, the Democrats, and it looks like the Republicans are just going to be in the audience, onlookers, and they have no power or no authority, or they don't get the green light to subpoena. Or can they? Or what about whistleblower now?
Well, I mean, to answer
Yeah.
your question,
Yes.
can the House do this?
Yes, the House can.
They can do it.
I thought they
Now,
need the whole House.
If they do it.
If they do it.
Which is to deviate from historical practice. They run the risk that the country will conclude, I think appropriately,
Right.
that it's a partisan exercise.
Yes.
And understand at the end of the day, you cannot remove a president from office unless it's a bipartisan exercise, because
Right.
there's no way you would ever get to a two-thirds majority, which is what is required in the Senate by vote in order
Correct.
to remove a president, unless both parties agreed,
Right.
Because, unless you've got two-thirds, and the only way you'd ever have that is you'd have to also have, in addition to all Democrats, you'd have to have enough Republican in order to make a two-thirds majority.
And you don't see that.
And if you don't have that,
Right.
then you don't have a bipartisan effort to remove a president. And the founders understood
Right.
that it would only be in those situations that would warrant and justify the removal of a president contrary to the results of an election from office prior to the end of his term.
Okay, so it's quite obvious that that's not going to happen.
Pretty obvious to me that I think what we should expect here,
Right.
What we see is what we think we see,
Yes.
right? That probably before Thanksgiving, the House ultimately will vote
Definitely.
articles of impeachment, which will then, under the Constitution, call for the matter to be referred over to the Senate.
Senate. And
The Chief Justice of the United States would then preside, as the Constitution requires, in the event of the
Right.
impeachment of a president. And then, under Senate rules, you would then look to see possibly a trial, possibly motion practice in order to circumvent the need to have a trial. In other words, if there's a vote in the House of all the Republicans by a majority
Right.
with the vice president to break a tie if necessary, they could, it's at least possible, grant a motion to dismiss to avoid a trial in the Senate. Of course, that's politically problematic for a certain number of Republicans
Yes.
up for re-election in 2020 in swing states, Sue
Yeah.
Collins in Maine being one of them.
Correct.
Right?
Good
The senator
point.
from Cory Gardner from Colorado being another.
Yeah.
I don't believe she's up for a re-election, but Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, I think that would be a tough vote for
Yeah.
her to sort of short circuit. And I don't think that Romney would support in Utah. Mitt Romney would support short circuiting the process in the Senate. So I think Mitch McConnell may have a real issue here about almost if the House acts and votes to impeach, it may be also all but inevitable that there will be some kind of a trial in the Senate, which it looks like he's committed most recently over the weekend. Apparently the Republican senators met and discussed this. I think the plan is to have what may be a 4 to 6 week trial following Thanksgiving, which presumably would occur in through and including December of this year, with a view toward getting all of this done and resolved before the end of the year.
How would a trial take place if that's we're talking about hypothetically, pretty much?
Well,
If that happens.
it could be an all-day
Right.
event.
Where would that take place? In the House or in the Senate?
No, it would actually take place in the
In
Senate.
the Senate.
Right.
Correct.
With the Chief Justice sitting in the presiding officer's chair, and he would have to be there all during the course of that trial.
Right. Okay. Just if the president if this were to happen, they would get the majority of the House, like you had mentioned, and then a majority of the Republicans, which they need, right? If that were to happen and Donald Trump were impeached, what happens after that? Once he's impeached, you mentioned the trial, of course,
Right.
And
Well, the trial.
what would happen to the president?
The trial in the Senate, of course, would have witnesses presented by both sides. There
Right.
would be an adversarial proceeding. The impeachment would be led by House managers that would come over from the House of Representatives, and they would lead the presentation of evidence before the Senate. The Chief Justice would preside and make rulings, and the president would be defended by counsel of his choosing. It might be a combination of the White House counsel, his own private lawyers, or lawyers separately retained in order to conduct a trial in the in the Senate. At the conclusion of that trial, there would be a vote, and it would take, again, a 2/3 vote to remove a president from office.
Right. Now,
If that were to happen,
yes.
the vice president of the United States would
take over.
would become president.
Correct. I don't think they want to see that either. Now, so what is the terminology right now? What's going on? Is it an inquiry? Is it a hearing? When we talk about an impeachment inquiry. So right now they're looking to put information together to actually put an impeachment process together.
I think it's probably fair to characterize it as an inquiry, which means to me that it is preliminary.
Right.
The next step after that, after they take that evidence and whatever it is the Democrats are doing behind closed doors, ultimately what has to happen is that articles of impeachment would have to be drawn. That would typically be done by the House Judiciary Committee.
How can they do that behind closed doors?
Well, when they get to articles, I don't think that can be done. I mean, that actually would have to be in an open proceeding before the Judiciary Committee. Those articles would be drafted by House Democrats. Then there would be a vote in committee. If that vote is in favor of the majority, which the Democrats would have, then that would cause those articles of impeachment to be referred to the entire floor, meaning the entire body of the House. And then the House would have to actually vote those articles of impeachment by majority vote. And they would, of course, the Democrats would have the majority in the House. But that would be the vote of the entire body. Yes.
Are they actually doing this impeachment process pretty much different than we did with Bill Clinton?
Yes, it is. I think it is fair to say whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it, it's unprecedented. It's never been done this way before.
Why the change?
I think the change is that Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, does not want to have that preliminary vote because she knows if she had that vote would be a lopsided vote in which almost the entire Republican caucus would vote no and the entire Democratic caucus would vote yes, which would only serve to reinforce the public perception of this, that it is a partisan effort.
But wouldn't the public perception indicate that Did she change the rules? So if there are rules in regard to using previous impeachment proceedings, if she liked that, unlike Clinton and I think Adams, correct, prior to the that's happened before.
Yeah, it's only been
two other impeachments. I think
Andrew Johnson,
Andrew
who
Johnson,
was after Abraham Lincoln, right?
Correct.
And then Richard Nixon.
Well, he resigned.
And then Bill Clinton.
Right.
And now this one.
Correct.
And the only other time in our history where it ever really sort of got close to approaching it was Andrew Jackson, but it ultimately resulted in a censure, not an impeachment. So those are the only times in the entire history of the country, through all of our presidents, where this has
Correct.
ever happened before. But I don't think you're going to see Speaker Pelosi call for that vote until they actually have articles of impeachment. And then I think they will proceed to a vote on the floor simply on the articles.
Okay. Could she be challenged in regard to the proceedings that went on with Andrew Jackson and Bill Clinton, and now it's a completely different way to do this with Donald Trump? Could that be?
The House under the Constitution is in control of its own proceedings. I don't think that's the place to challenge it. Where I have thought the best place to challenge it is if it is entirely a partisan effort that was initiated, in my view, in a defective process by running this thing through a committee behind closed doors without the ability of providing the minority with rights, including the ability to subpoena and call witnesses. I think the place to challenge that as defective is once it makes its way over to the Senate with a well-founded motion to dismiss, to say, hey, wait a second, this is a partisan exercise by the House of Representatives. It was contrary to established procedure and therefore defective. And that we think, based upon a motion, that a motion should be granted to dismiss the proceedings without the need for a trial. In other words, my view is if you're going to engage in a partisan effort in the House of Representatives, one good rejoinder deserves another. Why not also have a completely partisan response in the Senate to say, well, we're in the majority in the Senate, and we don't think these are well-founded articles of impeachment, and a motion to dismiss is granted. Now, if that motion were filed, of course, it goes to the presiding officer, who's the Chief Justice of the United States. Based upon past practice, it is usually the case on something as substantive as that, or as I shouldn't say substantive because it's a procedural motion, but it's something as weighty as that. The Chief Justice is likely to defer that matter to a vote of the entire Senate. Again, the Senate, by a majority vote, would have to decide whether or not to grant a motion to dismiss. That, of course, as we talked about earlier, would present some real political issues for Republican senators who are up for re-election.
Definitely in the area, of course.
In swing states. Now, whether they would go down that road, I think we'll have to wait and see. We don't know what this is going to look like, 2 months from now in December. But I'm just telling you, asked what could possibly happen. That's what possibly could happen. If that motion's not granted, of course, then there would be a trial.
Right. Okay. Robert Roy, how did we get this far with this proceeding, inquiry or hearing, without disclosing who the whistleblower is? How was that being done? How was it done?
I think the argument has been in the political domain to protect the identity and the anonymity of the whistleblower at all costs.
Right.
On the other hand, there's also an equally important feature of our constitutional system under the Sixth Amendment, which is the right to confront and cross-examine witnesses in what amounts to a quasi-criminal proceeding, which is impeachment. I don't know whether the whistleblower's identity will be compromise between now and the trial of impeachment. In many respects, it doesn't even really so much matter, does it, who the whistleblower is, since what the whistleblower blew the whistle on was the conversation between President Zelensky and President Trump, the transcript of which, or at least the summary of the call, we now have. So I don't know that...
But we don't have the whistleblower
I don't know that
herself.
The Democrats are engaged in an effort to sort of shore up the credibility of a whistleblower, which I guess they do for understandable reasons.
Whom we don't know.
Who we don't know. But on the other hand, what does the whistleblower really know other than what we already know now is in the call?
Correct.
And the whistleblower wasn't a party to the call by the whistleblower's own acknowledgement, right? So now that we have the benefit of the call, it seems to me the American people can judge for themselves about whether or not they thought that that conversation was in the the words of the president, perfect.
Yeah.
Or whether, you believe Adam Schiff that it's like the worst, god-awful thing that ever happened to the country, and
Right.
that, the president abused his office as the result of what transpired during that call. Look, at the end of the day, the president had the authority to withhold foreign aid. He had the
Correct.
authority, as we now know from what the White House Chief of Staff said,
Yes.
to do so through the end of the fiscal year, which was September 30th. I don't really think that there's anything improper about the president waiting to see whether or not Ukraine would open up an investigation
Right.
that the president asked for during that call, as long as the president didn't apply any pressure
Right.
to Ukraine, or that his people applied any pressure in order to cause that to happen. And I say that because I know Adam Schiff is smart enough guy to understand that if you're not able to show pressure, which is what apparently he's asking all these witnesses, the parade of witnesses
Correct.
from the State Department, if you don't have pressure, you don't have extortion,
Yeah.
you don't have for all practical purposes, you don't have bribery.
Bribery,
There's no
exactly.
campaign finance violation. The short answer to the end of that is you don't have any of those things.
Yeah.
You don't have a crime. So if you don't have treason, bribery, or other high crime and misdemeanor, you have no basis for impeachment. And all of the, hullabaloo right now about, oh, no, but it doesn't matter whether there was a crime, he abused his office. Well, that's nice that they say that, but
Right.
that's contrary to the Constitution.
Well, that's what I meant. How do we get this far just on basis of what you just said? In other words, we don't know who the. In fact, what we're saying is, as far as work that we know, it could be just hearsay from the whistleblower. How do we know the credibility of the, how can we determine that before we even have this process?
That's very difficult to do if you can't actually cross-examine that person, right?
Right.
And if you don't know their identity, there's no ability to confront and
That's what I
cross-examine.
meant. So how can you get this far? In other words, usually when you have a crime, you have a witness, you have somebody identified.
Right.
You have a motion to suppress, whatever.
And it's
So
also
these-
not clear to me, really, that the
Right.
whistleblower adds anything to this
Correct.
other than what the whistleblower apparently understood transpired during the course of this call, which
Right.
he learned from third parties.
Yes.
Not even necessarily people who were participants in the call.
No direct.
So
pretty
if he
much.
doesn't
Yeah.
have direct information,
Right.
That's interesting and that's all well and good. But
Yeah.
now that we have the call, when you think about it, what relevance really does that
Right.
whistleblower shed on an evaluation about whether or not that call was proper and whether or not the president's dealings with either directly in the context of that call or
Right.
indirectly through Rudy Giuliani or anybody else
Yeah.
was either proper or improper. And most importantly, aside from whether proper or improper, did any of that conduct constitute a crime
Right.
by the President of the United States? If not, then there's not a legitimate basis to
Yeah.
proceed forward with an impeachment. Look, in connection with Bill Clinton, the crime alleged was perjury and obstruction of justice. Okay, I made findings with regard to that.
Yeah, I know
yes,
you did, yes.
there was perjury and obstruction of justice.
Yeah.
It just wasn't appropriate in the best interest of the country and in the exercise of my discretion to prosecute him for those crimes
Right.
once he left office. But that's not to suggest that there wasn't substantial evidence of the
Right.
fact that those crimes were committed. That's the basis for an impeachable an event
Right.
and a proceeding. Now, ultimately, the country determined in the United States Senate that it didn't constitute an abuse of his public office
Yes.
and therefore didn't warrant removal. In the case of Richard Nixon, it was both.
Mm.
What were the crimes there? Obstruction of justice? Yes, because there was a slush fund that was accessed in order to pay off witnesses to alter
Right.
testimony in connection with an ongoing criminal investigation.
Yeah.
Everybody understands that that's a crime. And if the president was in on that conspiracy, and we
Yes.
know now he was because his own taping system
Correct.
proved the fact that that was the case, that would warrant both a high crime and misdemeanor, right? And also abuse of his office, warranting removal from office, which is why ultimately he resigned. And in the case of Andrew Johnson, the third prior example, in that case, the president was alleged to have violated an act called the Tenure of Office Act, which was arguably unconstitutional and ultimately found to be unconstitutional. That was the basis for their impeachment. Ultimately, their impeachment was about the fact they didn't like his Reconstruction policies after the assassination of President Lincoln. And there was an impending election, the result of which is that Ulysses Grant became the President of the United States. So he was impeached, but it came one vote short. He was not removed from office because ultimately, and also in the eyes of history, there wasn't a sufficient basis to remove him from office because he really hadn't committed a crime.
Now, you mentioned, of course, Adam Schiff is a very intelligent guy, which I think he is, but I think he's a little off the wall. Now, if he knows all of this...
I can't disagree with you about that either.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay. So if he again knows all of this, why would he be going through all these motions? And first of all, and I want to jump a little bit. How was he be able to go before Congress and tell a completely different story in regard to a phone call or in regard to a conversation by a whistleblower? How was he allowed to do that? He has an exemption? Is he exempt from lying before Congress?
I mean, the short answer and the honest truth of it, even though it's hard for many people to accept, is yes. Because there's another provision of the Constitution called the Speech and Debate Clause. And what it basically means is that anything that a congressperson or senator says is, while in the conduct of their duties before the Congress, is immune from liability, and they are not answerable, in the words of the Constitution, in any other place as a result of what they say. Now, Adam Schiff tries to justify that by saying it was parody. Clearly it was a lot worse than parody.
Right.
He completely mischaracterizes the evidence. By the way, a sin committed in the extreme by many of the major television and cable networks who, continue to raise the prospect of, well, it's obvious from the call that this was a quid pro quo. I have news for you. I've been, as a defense lawyer and a prosecutor, focused on the question of what constitutes bribery and extortion for the better part of the last 20 years. And I will tell you, it is not so easy, certainly not as easy as many people suggest that it is to prove. It's not enough to just have a phone call where the president, during one part of the conversation, mentions foreign aid, and in another part of the conversation says, can you do me a favor? Can you think about these investigations? That is not enough to show a corrupt quid pro quo under the federal bribery statute or the federal extortion statute. It really does have to be a corrupt undertaking in which there is really a promise and an understanding and an agreement that the president would not release foreign aid unless there was a commitment and pressure was applied in order to extract an investigation from Ukrainian authorities. And none of that has been shown to have occurred. And it seems to me, it's not it's not an insignificant fact that Adam Schiff wants to sort of paper over. So he can parody all he wants, but look at his actions. They are the best indicator of what it is he thinks he doesn't have, and that he knows that he needs in order to have a well-founded article of impeachment. What's he looking for? He's looking for evidence that suggests that pressure was applied in order to cause that result to happen. And if there's not sufficient evidence to show pressure was applied, then he knows that he doesn't have a well-founded article of impeachment.
Right. So in other words, there's no extortion, there's no bribery. There's none of that. No blackmail.
And it's really hard to make the argument, as many commentators have, that there was at least an illegal campaign contribution going on here. I mean, that's a real stretch of the federal campaign finance laws to say that when the president undertakes, as a matter of foreign policy, efforts that potentially benefit him in the political process, that's the same thing as saying, well, because he called for or asked for an investigation of the Bidens, that's the same thing as an in-kind campaign contribution from a foreign source to his campaign, and therefore it violates the Federal Election Campaign Act. I've heard that argument. that argument is a real stretch. I don't think
Right.
that is a violation, nor should it be, of criminal law. And any suggestion that that would be sufficient to remove, I think, a president from office strikes me as outlandish in the extreme.
But it looks like
But nevertheless,
Yeah.
it looks like it's going to happen anyway,
That's
whether
exactly.
whether I say so or not.
whether
So
it's
while Alexander Hamilton may not think that this is a good idea, apparently Adam Schiff and his infinite wisdom and Nancy Pelosi think to the contrary, and it seems all but inevitable that this is where we're headed.
right, I think it's quite obvious it's going to be an impeachment from their position from where they're sitting. Correct?
I think that's right.
I think yes.
I mean, I'd like to think otherwise,
Right.
and I'd like to think in the best interest of the country that we
Correct.
would not go there.
Right.
But, I'm not sitting in the House of Representatives.
Right.
The people's representatives are there. This is who they chose. These people are going to make a decision.
Yes.
Now, remember also, though, they're accountable for
They're
that
going to
decision.
make a decision.
They're going to make a decision.
They're going to make a decision.
And they're going to be
Yes.
held to account for that decision, including
How are they going to be held to
next
account?
year. They're going to be held next year in the electoral process in 2020.
But not criminally.
No.
No. Okay. Just all right. So just worried about how.
But see, this is one of our ills, and I will say this for both sides.
Yes.
I do not, and I can say this, I think, with some authority as a former federal prosecutor and a
both-
former
from
independent
both
counsel.
sides. Yeah. You
Be
can.
careful of both sides trying to turn every political dispute into one that rises to the level of a crime.
Right.
In other words, criminal prosecution and the heavy sledgehammer of an indictment, an arrest, and a charge and a trial with a potential penalty that means loss of liberty and imprisonment
Heavy.
should not be used in the political process. In other words, federal prosecution is not politics by other means. There's a great tradition in the Department of Justice to try to keep politics out of the decision-making loop when it comes to deciding whether or not to bring a charge against somebody where their liberty is at stake. I mean, seriously, do you really want a system in which the next party that takes control of the Justice Department decides to do political combat by bringing
Right.
criminal charges against the opposition? The only reason you would ever do that is because in a nonpartisan way you make a judgment that a fair-minded jury
Right.
has sufficient evidence that you're prepared to bring forward that would persuade them beyond a reasonable doubt of the defendant's guilt, warranting ultimately, potentially, the loss of liberty. That's a pretty serious thing. And we've gotten to a point in this country now where every time, someone thinks that the other side is doing something that they shouldn't do, that we want to turn that into a crime.
Yeah.
I think we need, on both sides, to stop thinking that way. That's not how we solve our problems. We solve our problems by our elected representatives and ultimately through the ballot box in choosing our leaders. We don't solve our problems by trying to turn every run-of-the-mill dispute between the political parties into one warranting either the proceeding with a criminal charge, or if we don't like the result of an election, the next best solution is to impeach that person and remove them from office.
But Robert Ray, we both know that the Democratic Party will use everything they can, including locking up the president if they could, and use every means that they could. Whether they're not, it's not going to be fair and square. They're going to do what they feel is best for them. And you said it a moment ago, no matter what, wrong, right, or indifferent, they're going to impeach the president.
Well, unfortunately, I think that's where we have gotten. You have
Yeah.
actually some Democratic members of the House, and usually laced with profanity, about what they would like to do, to the president.
But how are they? Exactly. That's a good thought. How are they getting away with that? If you and I did that, even you as a former prosecutor, I'm sure Secret Service would be knocking at your door.
Right. But again, the Constitution provides a fair amount of protection, in your words, immunity, to the fact that they can get away with an awful lot.
Right. But
and that was by design.
Yes, but what about the journalists that you touched on a moment ago? How can journalists be, they lie And Trump pretty much summed it up. And we thought it was a joke when they first called it fake news, but he's actually accurate. How could they report fake news 7 days a week, almost 24 hours a day? And what immunity do they have?
I have been out there in that process trying to appear both, on CNN and MSNBC,
Correct.
at the same time trying to do Fox and then NPR and PBS and all the rest, and Bloomberg and any number of other places. It is very disheartening to see, not even so much from the media themselves, but even from, for example, some of my former colleagues who are former federal prosecutors who literally go on the air and dressed up as being legal opinions, essentially espouse a political viewpoint. They don't hesitate to accuse constitutional officers like the currently sitting United States Attorney General of being engaged in the commission of crime, and they do so entirely without consequence. I think they know enough to know that if, for example, a lawyer or a former federal prosecutor ever got on air and criticized a federal judge, they would subject themselves possibly to disciplinary proceedings. But somehow or another, they see that they have free reign and license to accuse the Attorney General of the United States of even far worse, and do so literally without consequence. I have to tell you again, this is the discourse that we have now dissembled into, and it is not a healthy thing, and in my view, it is not good for the country, nor in the country's best interest. We ought to be able to reasonably disagree with one another and be honest about our factual disagreements without getting into, the politics of personal destruction, which is much of what I, currently see and what I think you are alluding to. And I suspect the reason it's done is because most people seem to think that they can make these statements without any further consequence.
No consequence at all. And it's because they can, and they are doing it.
Right.
But how did we get to this stage, How did we get to this stage where you'd be afraid at one time on the radio to say a curse word? Now you could deceive people, and you could actually tell them something that never occurred. I could say I saw Donald Trump running around with a naked guy 6 months ago, and it'll run like mad. It'll go all over the place with no impunity, and I have no problem, and nobody will go after me.
Partly, I guess we have the Supreme Court of the United States to thank for that, which is New York Times versus Sullivan, which says that when it comes to public figures, unless you can prove actual malice, which is essentially proof that the person who made the statement knowing that what they were saying was in fact false, which is always subject to the defense that they were just expressing their opinion. They weren't actually rendering a judgment about whether something was true or false. I think it's very difficult. And there, by the way, there are some members of the Supreme Court now who are actually questioning whether or not New York Times versus Sullivan should still be good law for precisely this reason. I mean, it definitely distorts the political process because it allows people to get away with an awful lot of things against public figures that they would never think about doing with regard to, you and I sitting on a subway platform. We would never say the things that we're allowed to say on air to somebody that we don't even know, that we just met on a Long Island Railroad platform, out here in Massapequa, right? And if we did that and we did it, we'd know that we would be subject ourselves to libel or slander.
Yeah, right. It's just mind-boggling. Is that now Adam Schiff again? Wasn't Jerry Nadler supposed to head this committee at first?
Well, that was where it started, but apparently Speaker Pelosi decided that wasn't going all that well in connection with their initial efforts to try to impeach the president over the Mueller investigation. And having failed in that effort, once they had the phone call, they decided to give Adam Schiff a try. If it doesn't work out with him, I suppose there are probably 4 or 5 other committee chairmen in the House where they can continue to sort of take up the mantle of impeachment proceedings. Ultimately, the public's patience is going to run thin with this. And I suspect also that there's a limited window here, which is why I know the House's Democrats are trying to proceed quickly with this. One of the reasons not to have a vote to open up this thing to cross-examination is that it would have slowed it down. And Nancy Pelosi knows that, there's no way the public is going to tolerate this next year in 2020,
Correct.
in the middle of an election
Another
cycle.
2.5 years of Mueller.
Well, right. So you know, they're doing what they're doing, knowing that they only have the public's patience for a short amount of time. They either get this thing done by Thanksgiving or this is over. So they're going to be hell-bent and determined to have an impeachment vote by Thanksgiving. And then Mitch McConnell will get this, and we'll see where it goes in the Senate. But by all outward appearances, he seems to be committed, trial or no trial, to have this over with before the end of the year.
Correct.
And I think, again, that has to be the case because, remember, starting in January, February, we're in the middle of primaries and caucuses and an election. And everybody understands that if impeachment is hanging over the president in an election year, that it can only be for one reason, and that's for partisan political purposes, which, again, as the framers recognize, that's an improper basis to conduct an impeachment proceeding leading to a removal of a president from office.
Well,
that's why we have elections.
Well, maybe that's what they want.
Well, they may want that, and they may want to try to damage the president in that process.
Exactly.
But, you know, remember also, they do this, they're also potentially subject to being held to account. And that means both the third of the Senate that's up for re-election next year, as well as all members of the House of Representatives. Every one of them is going to have to justify to their constituents why they took the action that they did relative to impeachment.
So it's not going to be that easy as they, It's, but you know, I've got several calls already prior to you coming on the station, and they seen you on, I think it was
Mark Levin.
Well, Mark Levin. No, Laura Ingram asked you a question.
Sure.
And she wasn't happy. I don't think she was. When she asked you, do you think he's going to get impeached, and you gave an honest answer. You said yes, but you said here. But I don't think she gave you an opportunity to articulate why. You know, I think she might have assumed
it's not the result that I would like. I do
exactly.
not. I do not. I would like to think that we're better than that, and that it shouldn't be inevitable. But I fear, given the times we are in, that it is inevitable before Thanksgiving that that's what's going to happen.
Right. Very sad situation.
And I do think it's sad, and I think it's sad for our country. But given that, you know, all that we can do then is to utilize the procedures that the framers put into place well over 200 years ago, and that is the protection against aberrant action by the House of Representatives, meaning partisan efforts by the House, is the protection that the framers incorporated into the Constitution. A simple majority vote in the Senate will not do. The framers, in their wisdom, understood that the only way and the only reason there should ever be to remove a president is if both parties decide that that's what's necessary for the country. I don't think you're going to see that in the Senate, and there will not be a 2/3 vote in the Senate to remove the president. It will be defeated.
Yeah. You know, it's also sad, the so-called squad and the Democratic Party, the new young ladies, you know, I don't even think they're aware of the framers. You know, I don't think they know what's going on.
You know, I think I disagree with you there. I think they know what's going on. I just don't think they agree with it. I think they think that the Constitution in many ways is something to get around, and they don't agree with many of the features of the Constitution. When you go back and look what they've said, they want to see, if they don't agree with the Supreme Court decision, well, it's not enough to wait their turn to have justices that their party will appoint to the Supreme Court. We want to pack the court and enlarge the court so we can appoint more Democrats to the court. So they want to change the Supreme Court of the United States. Yeah. They don't like the fact that the Electoral College is in place, so they want to abolish the Electoral College, which would mean...
They did like it a few years ago.
Well, it depends. Again, I guess it depends on whose ox is being gored, right?
Yes, exactly.
But the point being is, it's, you know, the Electoral College is served to preserve in the Constitution the fact that we are a republic. We are not just a majority across the entire country. We are a republic in the sense that it's not just a federal system, but also a state system, and that states have rights and have an interest in deciding who the president of the United States should be. Otherwise, what would happen is you just have campaigning in New York and California and a few other states, and the remaining states in the country wouldn't make any difference. But anyway, that's their view of that. So there are many features of the Constitution that they disagree with, and their view of it is that it's an antiquated document and it should be sidestepped if necessary, so that the majority can get their way. Well, unfortunately, that's not the system that we live in.
What I meant was I didn't think they were swift enough. That's why when I was saying the four, what they call a squad, I don't think they pretty much know in tune with the Constitution. I think they just do what they want to do, say what they want to say, and that's the way it appears to me and many other people.
Well,
I don't think they,
and they're free to say that, but of course they also swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution, just like all constitutional officers must. And I think that's an important oath. And it's not the Constitution that you would like to see; it's the Constitution that, in fact, is there.
Exactly. We have to abide by. Now, worst comes to worst, and I'm saying that because I'm prejudiced. If the president were to be impeached, he has executive privilege. How would that work out? Can he use his executive privilege if he were to be impeached?
Well, he's not in a position to pardon himself, although
that's what I meant.
The Constitution doesn't actually speak to that. But I think the Constitution is written in such a way that it envisions that once if the president were to be impeached and removed from office, the Constitution essentially says that thereafter he should be subject to prosecution according to law. If you allowed for the possibility that he could impeach himself, of course, that couldn't happen.
Right.
And I think also the precedent for this is I think Richard Nixon knew enough to know that even before he resigned, he was not in a position to impeach himself.
Right.
Gerald Ford did that after the fact, and by the way, took a lot of heat at the time because people concluded that there must have been a pact between Nixon and Ford that allowed for that to happen. I don't think there was any evidence to indicate that occurred, but the fact that Ford impeached Nixon, which I think was ultimately in the country's best interest, cost him the next election. I mean, it was a courageous decision for which I think the Kennedy Library ultimately awarded him the Profile and Courage Award. And it truly was a Profile and Courage Award.
Right.
But to answer your question, I think both Ford and Nixon recognized that a president does not have the power to pardon himself.
Okay.
His successor could do that.
Got it.
But he could not himself.
Okay.
So, for example, if he were removed from office, could Mike Pence issue a pardon to the former president? Yes, he has the power to do that.
What would be the president's challenge if he were legally or otherwise, if he were to be impeached? What would he would have to do to depose
I don't
it?
think he has any challenge. I mean, if the Senate votes by 2/3 majority to remove him, that is a constitutional process. He, I suppose, could file a proceeding in a court, but a court would be bound to follow the Constitution just like anybody else, and a court would find that they would not interfere with that process.
Correct.
That's the Constitution is quite explicit that impeachment is in the hands of the United States Senate. If they voted to remove him, that's final. That's
final.
not subject to being relitigated in a court.
Okay.
And the only thing that would involve a court after impeachment would be in the event that criminal proceedings were brought thereafter to enforce the criminal law. And again, the only way a former president could avoid that would be in a situation in which a pardon would issue.
Right. All right. So the phone call that he had with Ukraine, they are considering high crimes and misdemeanors in that conversation. Correct? Is that what they're saying in regard to trying to impeach him? I think
many I think many people have said they're not even concerned about whether it's treason, bribery, or a high crime and misdemeanor. Right, they seem to immediately go to no. What he did there. Yes. And it's enough, is he abused his office.
I got it.
No president should ever be talking on a telephone with a foreign leader about trying to encourage them to investigate a political rival.
Right.
And in their view, separate and apart from whether or not any crime was committed, their view is that's enough, that's abuse of process and abuse of the public trust. And on that basis alone should be sufficient. He should be subject to impeachment.
Yeah.
It's a position I mean, I respect their view.
Right.
I just happen to disagree with it, and I don't think that was the founders' intention. I mean,
Well, I was going to ask.
and also I think past practice has indicated,
Right.
again, two things have to happen for there to be a well-founded article of impeachment. It has to both be
Right.
either treason, bribery, or other high crime and misdemeanor, which means
what I
that a
meant.
crime has to
Yeah.
have been committed, and it has to be abuse of the public trust.
Okay. So none of that fits into this, even with the whistleblower.
I don't think
What-
they've
what
ever
will
been
we
able
know?
to point to a crime.
Right.
So I think that
So
on
I'm
that
not-
basis alone, it's out. And then I
Correct.
guess people can have reasonable disagreement.
Sure.
What is abuse of public trust
Right.
mean? I think, at least in my view, what it means is it's a violation. It would have to be shown to be a violation of the president's oath of office to take care that the laws be faithfully executed and to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's the president's oath of office in sum and
Right.
substance. And you'd have to show that he violated that oath. In other words, a violation of a position of public trust. I guess reasonable people can disagree. That's a little
Sure.
bit more nebulous to try to figure out exactly, what that is and when has a president crossed over the line. But I think in the first instance, they skip past the step of, look, we don't even get to the question about whether there's been an abuse of trust until we first established that a crime was committed. And I mean, call me crazy, but I mean, I've gone through this with everybody. It's not treason.
Right.
It's not bribery.
Good.
Okay. It's not extortion. And it's
Wow.
not an illegal campaign contribution.
Not
So if it's
abuse of
not one,
authority,
so if it's not one of those four things, then it's not a crime.
No intimidation, no misconduct.
Right. If it's no pressure and no intimidation
then
and
there's
no threat,
Yeah.
then there's no extortion. And if there's no extortion, at least in my judgment, no
Right.
crime has been committed, and therefore there's no impeachable event.
Saying all of that, right, and obviously I agree with you, many people do as well, we're still going to enforce the impeachment.
Whether I say
Whether
so
you-
or not,
he's going to be impeached.
it's going to happen.
Right.
Again, sorry
Right.
to say, I said it on Laura Ingraham.
I know.
And
Well-
I don't relish this, and I don't say it with obviously any joy. I say it with a
Correct.
great deal of disappointment in my voice. But unfortunately,
Right.
that's where we are.
And disappointment in our country.
I'm disappointed.
Truthfully.
Well,
and what's going
look,
on with our system, it's amazing.
I on occasion am disappointed in the country, but the one thing that I never ever lose
Right.
faith in is the ability of the country in matters of national importance to get it right.
Yes.
And we have proven throughout our history, without exception, with regard to those big matters, that we do get things right. So ultimately, there'll be an impeachment and through the House,
Right.
and we're going to waver off course. But ultimately, the genius of the system is, again, on the big things, we get it right. And I think getting it right will mean that will be defeated in the Senate.
Well, getting it right, Robert Ray, we're looking forward to that. I want to thank you for being my guest. An hour went by already. Would you believe it?
I can't believe it.
Yes.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful to have you, folks. I hope you got a lot of your questions answered. And I hate that, with a smile, I'm going to say he's going to be impeached, but we're going to be in good shape.
The country's going to be just fine.
Thanks. I'm glad to hear that. Okay, Robert Roy, thank you, former prosecutor, New York, my old area when I was running around there doing my cop stuff.
It was the best. It still is the best.
It is. And I thank you. I thank you for being interested in being a prosecutor. Also, you didn't have an easy job.
It was the best job I ever had.
Oh, that's what Rudy Giuliani had said.
Yep.
You know?
And he hired me.
Oh,
So there you go.
He hired me also. He appointed me chief of the sheriff's department.
We have something in common.
Thank you, Robert Roy, for being the guest on StreetWise. And this is Lou Telano, and I'll catch you later.